At the time of this lull in the firing, it was, perhaps, a little after 9 o'clock. Sumner had been impatient at the 3 hours' delay imposed upon his corps, and as he listened to the tremendous musketry and artillery of the two first combats, he doubtless recalled the field of Seven Pines, where he had arrived in time to save the battle. His corps had not fought at Saude Manassas, and consequently it was large, numbering in its 9 brigades over 17,000 men. It came upon the field led by Sedgwick's 3 brigades in column of brigade front. Sumner rode with this division. French's and Richardson's divisions followed in echelon to the left and rear. Before the Committee on the Conduct of the War, Sumner afterward testified as follows. On going upon the field, I found that Hooker's corps had been dispersed and routed. I passed him some distance in the rear where he had been carried wounded, but I saw nothing of his corps at all as I was advancing with my command on the field. There were some troops lying down on the left, which I took to belong to Mansfield's command. In the meantime, Mansfield had been killed, and a portion of his corps, formerly Banks's, had been thrown into confusion. The troops of the 12th Corps which Sumner saw lying down were the remains of Greene's division, about the Dunker Church, and it were better for Sumner had they not held ground so far in front of their general line. For Sumner did not realize that he was now within the Confederate lines, and he continued his advance into the woods, leaving the church and Greene's forces on his left. The formation of his division was in too close order to be safely brought under fire. He should have taken greater intervals between his brigades. It is said that they were only between 50 and 100 feet apart. In this formation, he pushed through the rather open woods with occasional rocky ledges, and passed, without being aware of it, Early's brigade upon his right with the remnants of Jones's division under Grigsby and Stafford, and on his left he passed the remnants of Walker's 2 brigades, who were holding in front of Greene's troops about the church. Early, himself unseen by reason of a ridge between them, moved down parallel to Sedgwick's march, leaving Grigsby and Stafford behind to hold his rear against some troops in echelon behind Sedgwick's right, who seemed disposed to follow. As soon as Early passed the ridge which had concealed him, he opened fire upon the flank of Sedgwick's column. This was in such close formation that it could not deploy an opposing front. Just at this time, the head of the column emerged from the woods on the far side and found itself presenting its left front angle to McLaws's division, which was deploying from column into line of battle within close range. Sedgwick had practically marched into an ambuscade. McLaws opened fire quickly from a front of a brigade and a half. The remaining brigades came into line at double quick and soon poured a terrific fire, taking Sedgwick's column so obliquely that it could not be effectively replied to. At the same time, the remnants of Walker's 2 brigades lined up against the left flank of the column, now almost helpless between converging fires. It has rarely happened that heavier losses have been incurred more rapidly. Sedgwick himself was wounded, with Dana, one of his brigadiers, and the losses of the division were 2210. It is stated by Ropes that Sedgwick's loss was all suffered in a very few minutes. In endeavouring to meet the flank fires, the rear brigade was ordered to face about. Fortunately, this order was understood by the brigade to mean a rearward march which was soon begun, and was hastily followed by the other brigades. The Confederates followed in pursuit, and once more the tide of battle swept across the ghastly cornfield and the adjacent open ground between the Dunkard or West Wood and an East Wood about 700 yards east of its northern end. Some of the brigades of D.H. Hill's left joined in the counterstroke, and the Federals were driven to the shelter of their strong line of artillery in front of the North Wood, which bounded the open fields to the northward. McLaws pushed his assault much too far, for his numbers were too light to hope for any great result, and the favourable ground enabled the enemy's artillery to punish severely all open exposures. Thus McLaws lost 1103 out of 2893 carried into action in his 4 brigades, Kershaw's, Semmers's, Barksdale's, and Cobb's, an average of 39%. These losses occurred mostly in the pursuit after Sedgwick, and mostly befell within 2 hours. At the same time that Sedgwick was driven back, Greene's men about the Dunker Church were also forced back to the Federal guns, leaving the Confederate line practically the same as it had been in the morning, although now held only by scattered fragments and almost entirely destitute of artillery. In each of these three affairs, the division batteries had been effectively fought against the enemy's infantry, but gradually they had nearly all been put out of action. As an illustration of their experiences and of the condition of our line at this time, McLaws, in his report, says, "Captain Redd's battery had been placed in position on the right of the woods which we had entered, and did most excellent service, but it was exposed to such a severe fire, General Kershaw ordered it back, after losing 14 officers and men and 16 horses. Another battery, Captain Carleton's, which I had ordered into position in the woods in front of General Ransom's brigade, was so severely cut up in a short time by the direct and crossfire of numerous batteries that I ordered it to retire." This finished the third affair of the day, though there were still upon the field Sumner's two other large divisions to be reckoned with, equal in strength to the whole of the 12th Corps, and in addition there could be seen across the Antietam, but moving to support the attack upon our left, the 6th Corps under Franklin. It was plain that a fourth and even more terrible struggle was to come, but it befell principally over new ground bordering the scene of the previous fighting upon the east and extending southward. Here the division of D.H. Hill held the salient east of the Hagerstown Pike, where our line of battle changed direction and became parallel to the pike. The ground was open and moderately rolling and had but one good feature for defence. This was a sunken road, an excellent thing when it has the right direction, perpendicular to the enemy's line of approach, but a dangerous trap if the enemy can obtain an enfilading position. The salient outline here involved this danger. In the second affair of the day, as has been told, D.H. Hill had sent 3 of his 5 brigades forward to support the flank of Hood's attack, and these brigades, Colquitt's, Ripley's and Garland's, had remained holding advanced ground about the roulette house, a few hundred yards in front of the sunken road before referred to. Here they had already suffered severe losses. When Sedgwick's division was driven back and hardly pressed, Sumner had sent word to French and Richardson to attack in order to make a diversion. From his position in echelon on Sedgwick's left and rear, French soon came into collision with D.H. Hill's advanced brigades. These made a stubborn defence for a while, but their front was narrow, and on its exposed right flank was Garland's brigade, which on the 14th had been routed and badly cut up at Turner's Gap. Hill reports, Garland's brigade, Colcher McRae commanding, had been much demoralised by the fight on South Mountain, but the men advanced with alacrity, secured a good position, and were fighting bravely when Captain Thompson, 5th N.C., cried out, "They are flanking us!" This cry spread like an electric shock along the ranks, bringing up vivid recollections of the flank fire at South Mountain. In a moment they broke and fled to the rear. Colonel McRae, though wounded, remained on the field all day and succeeded in gathering up some stragglers and personally rendered much efficient service. The 23rd N.C. of this brigade was brought off by the gallant Lieutenant Colin Johnston and posted by my orders in the old road already described. Ripley's brigade had united with Walker's and fallen back with it behind the ridge to the left of this road and near to it. We had now lost all the ground wrested from the enemy and were occupying the position held in the morning, but 3 of my brigades had been broken and much demoralised, and all of the artillery had been withdrawn from my front. Out of 10 field officers in Colquitt's brigade, which had fought after the giving way of Garland's brigade until its ranks were nearly mingled with the enemy's, 4 were killed and 6 wounded. Hill now had left in the sunken road only 2 of his original 5 brigades, G.B. Anderson, comparatively fresh, and Rhodes, who had been severely engaged at Boonesborough, losing 1/3 of his force. Here Hill received the united attacks of both French's and Richardson's divisions, and for some time successfully repulsed them. He was aided by R.H. Anderson's division, some 3,000 or 4,000 men, Hill reports, which had taken position in his rear. Anderson was soon severely wounded, and no one seems to have exercised active command of the division after he left the field, nor are any reports published of the division or any of its brigades or regiments except the casualties. These, in the 5 brigades of Wilcox, Mahone, Pryor, Featherstone and Wright, amounted to 1430 killed, wounded and missing, over 1/3 of the force engaged. Swinton describes the conflict at this period as follows. The action here was of a very animated nature, for Hill, being reinforced by the division of Anderson, assumed a vigorous offensive and endeavoured to seize a piece of high ground on the Union left with the view of turning that flank. This manoeuvre was, however, frustrated by the skill and promptitude of Colin Cross of the 5th N.H., Caldwell's brigade, who, detecting the danger, moved his regiments toward the menaced point. Between his command and the Confederate force there then ensued a spirited contest, each endeavouring to reach the high ground, and both delivering their fire as they marched in parallel lines by the flank. The effort to flank on the right was handsomely checked by Brooke, French, and Barlow, the latter of whom, changing front with his 2 regiments, obliquely to the right, poured in a rapid fire, compelling the surrender of 300 prisoners with 2 standards. When this fighting had lasted perhaps an hour, the Federals had gradually brought in the whole of French's and Richardson's divisions and extended their lines. At last they reached a position from which a portion of the sunken lane could be enfiladed. This being reported to Rhodes by the lieutenant-colonel of the 6th Ayler, he was directed to throw his right wing back and out of the road. Rhodes reports, "Instead of executing the order, he moved briskly to the rear of the regiment and gave the command, 6th Alabama about face, forward march." Maginn Hobson of the 5th, seeing this, asked if the order was intended for the whole brigade. He said, "Yes," and thereupon the 5th and the other troops on their left retreated. I did not see their retrograde movement until it was too late to rally them, and for this reason. Just as I was moving on, I heard a shot strike Lieutenant Birney, aide, who was immediately behind me. Wheeling around, I found him falling, and that he had been struck in the face. He found that he could walk after I raised him. As I turned to the brigade, I was struck heavily by a piece of shell on the thigh. At first I thought that the wound was serious, but finding upon examination that it was slight, I turned toward the brigade, when I discovered it, without visible cause to me, retreating in confusion. I hastened to intercept it at the Hagerstown road. I found, though, that with the exception of a few men, not more than 40 in all, the brigade had disappeared from this portion of the field. This small number, together with some Mississippians and North Carolinians, about 150 in all, I rallied and stationed behind a small ridge leading from the Hagerstown road. When, by this misunderstanding between Rhodes and Lieutenant-Colonel Lightfoot, Rhodes's brigade abandoned this sunken road, ever since known as the Bloody Lane, Lee's army was ruined, and the end of the Confederacy was in sight. Even the rank and file in the 5th Corps, looking on from across the Antietam, saw and appreciated the situation. "Now is the time," was a general comment. McClellan, from his headquarters at the Fry House, looked on, but he did not come, and he issued no order. The gap left by Rhodes was speedily filled by the encouraged Federals, and now the whole lane was enfiladed, and the slaughter which took place in it strewed it with dead and wounded, probably as thickly as has ever been seen in this country. G.B. Anderson's brigade, next on the left, attempted to stay the tide, but Anderson was killed, and in the rout which followed, the supporting troops of R.H. Anderson's division were involved, and only small squads of stragglers could be rallied at scattered points in the rear. The Confederates had, however, exacted severe penalties from French and Richardson. Neither suffered to quite the extent that Sedgwick had done, though each of them lost heavily, and Sumner himself had much of his ardour cooled. Richardson lost 1165 and was himself mortally wounded. French lost 1750. But the danger to the Confederates now lay in the presence on the field of Franklin, with Slocum's and Smith's divisions of the 6th Corps of about 6,000 each, fine troops and well commanded. Franklin, too, was anxious to attack. Already he had sent one brigade, Irwin's, to the relief of Greene when he was pursued out of the Dunkard woods, and this brigade found work enough to do to suffer 342 casualties. Another brigade, Hancock's, though not seriously engaged, formed as support to two of General Sumner's batteries, then severely pressed by the enemy, drove away his skirmishers who had already advanced close to the batteries and occupied some buildings and fences in front of his position. This brigade was the means of saving the two batteries. But, just as Franklin was about to attack, Sumner met him, and being the ranking officer, he ordered the attack postponed. Meanwhile, however, under the personal direction of Richardson himself and of Barlow, commanding 2 regiments in Caldwell's brigade, the battle was kept up by the troops already engaged, who were encouraged by their recent success and were quite disposed to follow it up. But there were no fighters in the Confederate army capable of more desperate and pertinacious defence than Longstreet and D.H. Hill. The latter's official report thus briefly summarises what followed. Cole Bennett of the 14th and Mage Sellers of the 30th, N.C. Regiment rallied a portion of their men. There were no troops near to hold the centre except a few hundred rallied from various brigades. The Yankees crossed the old road which we had occupied in the morning, and occupied a cornfield and orchard in advance of it. They had now got within a few hundred yards of the hill which commanded Sharpsburg and our rear. Affairs looked very critical. I found a battery concealed in a cornfield and ordered it to move out and open upon the Yankee columns. This proved to be Boyce's SC battery. It moved out most gallantly, although exposed to a direct and reverse fire from the long-range artillery across the Antietam. A caisson exploded, but the battery unlimbered, and with grape and canister drove the enemy back. Boyce fired 70 rounds of canister and lost 19 men and 15 horses. I was now satisfied that the Yankees were so demoralized that a single regiment of fresh men could drive the whole of them in our front across the Antietam. I got up about 200 men who said they would advance to the attack if I would lead them. We met, however, with a warm reception, and the little command was broken and dispersed. Major Hobson and Lt. I.M. Goff of the 5th Ayler acquitted themselves handsomely in this charge. Cole Alfred Iverson, 20th N.C., Cole D.H. Christie, 23rd N.C., Captain Garrett, 5th N.C., A. Jate, J.M. Taylor and Lt. Isaac E. Pierce of the same regiment had gathered up about 200 men, and I sent them to the right to attack the Yankees in flank. They drove them back a short distance, but were in turn repulsed. These 2 attacks, however, had a most happy effect. The Yankees were completely deceived by their boldness, and induced to believe that there was a large force in our centre. They made no further attempt to pierce our centre. These details give an instructive lesson in the value of pertinacity. Longstreet with his staff helped man 2 guns of the Washington artillery and materially aided in the result. While Richardson's advance was still being pushed, Pleasanton advanced about 3 brigades of cavalry and 4 batteries across the Antietam, by the Boonesborough Bridge. The batteries crowned the hills upon our side and opened fire, supported by the cavalry and by a regiment of regulars deployed as skirmishers. Presently the line was reinforced by 3 more batteries of the 5th Corps and Buchanan's brigade of regulars. These troops felt of our line quite heavily, the pressure coming upon Evans's brigade and parts of the brigades of Wilcox, Featherstone and Pryor of R. H. Anderson's division, and G. T. Anderson of D. R. Jones's division. D. H. Hill, himself on foot, having had 3 horses killed under him during the morning, and carrying a musket, led some of these troops which he had rallied. S. D. Lee's battalion of artillery was also now back upon the field with ammunition replenished, and this demonstration was presently driven back under cover of the hills bordering the Antietam. Pleasanton, who appreciated the opportunity, called for reinforcements, but McClellan had started on a visit to his right flank and had ordered 2 brigades of regulars of the 5th Corps to follow him. The absence of these brigades prevented Porter from complying with Pleasanton's request, so his demonstration was abandoned, and his troops and artillery were withdrawn, having suffered something over 100 casualties. When McClellan reached the field on his right, he conferred with Sumner and Franklin. The latter urged a renewal of the attack, but Sumner advised against it, and McClellan took his advice. Franklin was ordered simply to stand on the defensive. The 2 brigades of regulars brought over from the centre were marched back. Thus, McClellan's expedition to the right at a critical time saved the shattered Confederate lines from 2 assaults by fresh troops, on their left and on their centre, just at the time when Burnside was beginning to get in serious work upon their right. The battle was now practically finished upon the Federal right and centre, and finished in a draw. We may now turn to their left. In his final report, dated August 4, 1863, McClellan writes that he sent an order to Burnside to carry the bridge in front of him at 8 a.m., but in his preliminary report, August 15, 1862, he says the order was communicated at 10 a.m. Burnside's report, dated September 30, gives the same hour. General Cox, who had charge of the initial operations in his report, dated September 23, gives the hour as 9 a.m., and all the circumstantial evidence bears this out as correct. The immediate defence of the bridge was made by Toombs with the 2nd, 20th and 56th Gay. Regiments, about 600 men, supported by Richardson's, Eschliman's and Eubank's batteries. His infantry was partially covered by a thin wood, but the ground, sloping toward the stream, gave little shelter from the enemy's fire. Burnside's corps comprised 4 divisions of 2 brigades each, averaging about 1,500 men to each brigade. Rodman's division was sent to the extreme left to make its attack upon a ford a half-mile below the bridge, where a re-entrant angle gave the Federals a strong attack. There was here only a Confederate picket. The other Federal divisions were under cover opposite the bridge, with abundant artillery on the hills. When the orders to attack were received, the artillery fire, of which there had been some all the morning, was redoubled, and skirmishers were pushed forward close to the stream. Crook's brigade was directed to approach as nearly as possible, unobserved, and then to make a dash for the bridge. But Crook missed his direction, and when he came near the stream, he found himself somewhat above the bridge, and under such a heavy fire that he could not approach closer. He took what cover he could get, and opened fire on the Confederate position. So the first Federal effort was a failure. A second effort was soon organised to be made by Sturgis's division. Sturgis sent 2 regiments from Nagel's brigade, covered by the fire of the rest of this brigade and of Ferrero's brigade. Their hot reception by Toombs's Georgians checked the advance before they could reach the bridge, and the second effort was also a failure. Meanwhile, more urgent orders from McClellan were coming to Burnside, and being reiterated by him to his subordinates as the battle upon the Federal right grew more desperate. Of course, Toombs's 3 regiments and 3 batteries, fighting without entrenchments and in the open country along the Antietam, could not hope to do more than merely to delay 4 divisions with 8 or 10 batteries. By this time the enemy had discovered all our weak points, and their own strong ones, and Toombs's ammunition was getting low, for he could not replenish under the enemy's fire. Moreover, Rodman's division had already driven off the picket force at the ford below, and Toombs knew that it would soon appear in his rear. He had, however, not only saved 3 precious hours, but he had put up a fight which had so exhausted both the energy and ammunition of his adversary as to entail upon them the loss of 3 hours more before they would be across the bridge and prepared to begin their attack on our right. During all these 6 hours, A.P. Hill would be marching rapidly. It was said that on this march he stimulated laggards with the point of his dress sword. For his third attack, Cox took 2 regiments, marching by the flank side by side. The regiment on the right was left in front, and the one on the left was right in front. Crook, too, organised 5 companies of the 28th O to cross at a ford opposite his position, a short distance above the bridge. About 1 p.m. the charge was made. Toombs knew that his game was played, and all that remained to make it a perfect success was to safely withdraw his men. He did this with combined skill and good luck. He gave the enemy a farewell volley, ran safely to the rear, replenished his ammunition, got together parts of his brigade which had been detached, and took an active part in the final assault of the day, which drove the enemy to cover in the valley of the Antietam. Rodman had gotten over, practically without opposition, before the charge upon the bridge, and Crook had carried the ford above the bridge at the same time with the charge. The losses on either side in this affair are not given, but the total killed and wounded for the whole day in the 3 Georgia regiments was 217, about 38%. But they had saved the day, for while the Federals were crossing the Antietam, A.P. Hill forded the Potomac. Having crossed the bridge, Burnside's first task was to secure his possession of it against any counterstroke by bringing over a number of batteries. With these he crowned the adjacent heights, while his infantry deployed under their crests. Meanwhile came urgent orders from McClellan to press his advance. But the 3 brigades of Nagel, Ferrero, and Crook, which had been engaged, reported their ammunition as nearly exhausted. Sturgis also reported Nagel and Ferrero as too exhausted physically to be fit for an immediate advance. On this, Wilcox's division, with an ammunition train, was ordered across the creek, and Wilcox relieved Sturgis in the advance. These arrangements just consumed the time remaining in which an advance could have been opposed only with 4 of Jones's brigades, under Drayton, Garnett, Walker, and Kemper, and the fragments of earlier battles which could be rallied in the rear. Wilcox's division formed the right wing of the line of battle, and Rodman's the left. Cox's division gave Crook's brigade to support Wilcox, and Scammond's to support Rodman, while Sturgis in reserve held the heights near the bridge. At 4 p.m. the advance was made in handsome style, somewhat to the right oblique, so as to envelop the village of Sharpsburg. In front of this village it struck Jones's 4 brigades, which had been held all day unengaged, but exposed to the enemy's rifle fire across the Antietam. Though now scarcely numbering 2,000 men, they made a desperate fight, as the casualties upon both sides attest. But the long Federal lines gradually overlapped their narrow fronts, and the Federal progress, though slow, was sure. The Confederates hurried to oppose them with all the artillery and the fragments of infantry which could be drawn from their left, many of those going being already wounded. Before the advancing troops of A.P. Hill appeared upon the scene, the leading Federals had crossed the brook running east from the town into the Antietam and were well up on the slope of Cemetery Hill, while others occupied the eastern part of the village. It had been about 3 p.m. when A.P. Hill, coming up from the ford with his 5 brigades, had first reported in person to Lee. Getting information as to localities from D.R. Jones, he formed 3 brigades on the right of Jones and advanced to the attack. The other 2 brigades, Pender and Brockenbrough, were placed on his extreme right, looking to a road coming from across the Antietam at its mouth. One of his batteries, under McIntosh, which had been sent ahead to the relief of Jones, had been left unsupported as Jones was driven back. The guns had fired canister until the enemy's line was within 60 yards, when the limbers and caissons were withdrawn, leaving the guns in the hands of the enemy. Meantime, in the enemy's oblique advance, a gap had opened between Wilcox on the right and Rodman on the left, now become the rear. In fact, the movement had converted the line into a formation of brigades in echelon, and the interval between Wilcox and Rodman had widened as Wilcox, over less exposed ground, had advanced more rapidly. Now, having gained a foothold on the edge of Sharpsburg, he had stopped his advance to bring up his ammunition wagons. Rodman had found the enemy extending to his left and was passing, on his extreme left, some fields of high corn, which cut off his view upon that flank. The 4 Confederate brigades advanced to the attack in the order from the left: Toombs, Archer, Branch, and Gregg, not in a continuous line, but with intervals of from 100 to 300 yards between them, which enabled them to overlap both of the Federal flanks. Gregg's brigade on the right, having replenished their tattered wardrobes from the blue Federal uniforms captured at Harper's Ferry, were at first mistaken for friends, and approached to close quarters through the high corn before they opened fire. The weight of the attack fell upon the 3 brigades under Rodman, say 4,500 men. The Confederates probably numbered 2,700, but the attack was furious, and enveloping both flanks, it was successful from the first. Rodman was killed early in its progress. Among the Confederates, Branch was killed and Gregg wounded. McIntosh's guns were recaptured, and the whole Federal line, although resisting, was forced back toward the Antietam. Cox at once ordered forward Sturgis's division to support the line, and also sent orders to Wilcox to withdraw his 3 brigades from the vicinity of Sharpsburg to the place where his division had formed under cover near the river. With the assistance of Sturgis, the Confederate pursuit was finally checked, but not until all the ground over which the enemy had advanced had been recovered, and the approach of night had at last put an end to the battle. As darkness enveloped the scene, the Confederates, worn and exhausted by 8 days of marching and fighting, dropped down where they stood to sleep and could scarcely be roused even to eat the cooked rations brought up from their camps in the rear. When all was quiet, the division commanders met where Lee had taken his position on the road near the village, and made their separate reports of the condition of their commands. Without exception, all reported heavy losses and the men exhausted, and all considered it necessary to withdraw from the field during the night. Lee alone was in no wise moved. He had read McClellan's inmost soul and knew he was not to be feared. Without a word of explanation or asking advice from either Jackson or Longstreet or anyone else, he directed all to collect their stragglers, strengthen their lines, and be prepared to renew the battle in the morning. When the morning dawned, disclosing the opposing skirmishers in easy range, and the hostile guns nowhere out of range, but no shot being fired on either side, the Confederates drew long breaths of relief. Many men already half understood McClellan, but Lee alone had read him thoroughly and speculated boldly upon the knowledge. Indeed, when the advancing hours of the forenoon had made it certain that McClellan did not intend to attack that day, Lee recurred to a proposed plan of the day before to turn McClellan's right, and he abandoned it reluctantly only after careful reconnaissance by Coley S.D. Lee, on learning of the peculiar strength and heavy preparation of the enemy at that point. Now there was nothing left to do but to recross into Virginia. In the afternoon the orders were given and the trains were started. Soon after dark, the movement of the troops began, and when the sun was 2 hours high on the morning of the 19th, everything was safely across. General Walker, in an account of the battle in Battles and Leaders of the Civil War, writes, "Detained in superintending the removal of a number of the wounded of my division, I was among the last to cross the Potomac. As I rode into the river, I passed General Lee sitting on his horse in the stream, watching the crossing of wagons and artillery. Returning my greeting, he inquired as to what was still behind. There was nothing but the wagons containing my wounded and a battery of artillery, and I told him so. 'Thank God,' I heard him say as I rode on." In offering battle on the 18th, Lee had everything to lose and nothing to gain. McClellan, on the contrary, in accepting battle, would have had everything to gain both for himself and his cause, and nothing to lose. He had 24,000 men who had not been seriously engaged, and 12,000 more near enough to come into the battle before noon. Couch's division, 6,000 strong, recalled from its useless expedition to Maryland Heights, rejoined the army early in the morning on the 18th, and Meade's division, 6,000 strong, arrived by 11 a.m. It is strange but true that with 36,000 fresh men at hand, neither McClellan nor any of his 6 corps commanders, except Franklin, approved the idea of an attack. Ropes says that Franklin alone recognized the importance of the high ground held by Stuart and desired to begin by driving him and his artillery from it. This point was indeed one of the key points of Lee's line, but the dominant feature of the whole situation was the fact that Lee was fighting with his back to a river which he could not have crossed under fire. McClellan fought with a safe retreat assured to him, in case of disaster, by the Antietam in his front and the powerful artillery on the hills behind it. The battlefield is unique among the fields of the war, in offering all the prizes to the Federals and all the risks to the Confederates. To McClellan, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. One other feature of this battle is worthy of special note as unique. McClellan concentrated his powerful cavalry and horse artillery force not upon either flank, and especially not upon his left flank, where were great opportunities for it, but at his centre, where it would have been in the way of his infantry, and where the ground was much cut up with fences and cultivation. On his right, it might have been able to drive Stuart from his commanding hill. On his left, from which direction he should have expected Jackson's troops, it might have crossed the bridge over the Antietam near its mouth. Where it was superfluous. When, on the morning of the 19th, it was discovered that Lee had retreated, a brigade of cavalry was ordered in pursuit and was soon followed by Porter's corps. I have before, in the account of the Battle of Malvern Hill, spoken of our reserve artillery under the command of Pendleton, and not attached to any division. It had been left in Richmond when Lee with Jackson and Longstreet advanced against Pope. After McClellan was withdrawn from the James, it marched with D.H. Hill's division and joined the army in Maryland on Sept. 8. On the 10th and 11th it marched to Hagerstown with Longstreet's corps, and on the 14th returned with it to Boonesborough. That night, when the army was put in motion for Sharpsburg, Pendleton was ordered to take the reserve artillery across the Potomac at Williamsport and distribute it to guard the fords of the Potomac at that point, and below to Shepherdstown. Hence it happened that on the morning of the 19th, the hills on the Virginia side of Boteler's Ford were being held by 15 light-rifled guns and 19 smoothbores of Pendleton's reserve, while 10 other smoothbores were held close by. In his advance to the river, Pleasonton's cavalry picked up 167 stragglers, 1 abandoned gun, and 1 colour. When he approached the river, he was opened upon by Pendleton's artillery. Gibson's, Tidball's, and Robertson's batteries of horse artillery, 18 guns, went into action and replied so effectively as to silence most of the Confederate guns, and also to run off all camps and wagon trains in sight near the river. After 2 hours of this, the Federal cavalry and its artillery were relieved by the arrival of the 5th Corps, by which the affair was kept up until night. The canal bank along the river on the Maryland side served the purpose of a parapet, and enabled the enemy to aid their artillery fire with a heavy fire of musketry against the Confederate guns and sharpshooters on the Virginia side, where there was but little cover. During the afternoon, this combined fire compelled the abandonment of several guns. Seeing this, the 4th Micheros forded the stream and took possession of 4 of them. After dark, this regiment was withdrawn, but early on the 20th, Porter started to cross the 2 divisions of Morrell and Sykes and a brigade of cavalry. Meanwhile, Pendleton, during the night, had found Lee and reported, and Lee had ordered Jackson to send back his nearest division. This was A.P. Hill's. Fortunately, Hill moved early, and, forming in 2 lines of battle, he approached the ford before Porter had gotten more than a half of his men across. Porter, informed that a large force was approaching, decided to withdraw, and did so with but little loss. One regiment, however, the 118th PA, was thrown into confusion and driven over a steep descent and across the river under fire, losing 269 men. The total losses reported by the Federals for this affair were 363. A.P. Hill reported 30 killed and 231 wounded. Pendleton reported 3 killed and 4 wounded of his reserve artillery. I have already told of my being sent on the 16th to Harper's Ferry to remove the captured ordnance stores and to bring what was available for use to Sharpsburg. I sent to Winchester 49 field pieces and 24 mountain howitzers, and quite a lot of artillery ammunition not suitable for our calibers. Of what was suitable, the supply was small, except of canister. There was also a fair amount of small-arm ammunition. Much of it had been brought from the depots and unloaded along Miles's entrenchments, ready for use. While gathering this in the afternoon from Bolivar Heights, I could see the smoke of the conflict and the incessant bursting in the air of shells and shrapnel over the field where Burnside made his advance and was beaten back by A.P. Hill. I could not tell how the fight was going, but at that time no Confederate expected anything less than victory. I was until late at night dispatching wagons to Winchester and to the ford near the battlefield. I finished the work next morning and returned to the vicinity of the ford in the afternoon. Here I found orders to await the army, which would recross the river that night, and here the next morning we received a liberal shelling from the enemy's horse batteries across the river, which perforated some of our wagons, but did no other harm. The Confederate casualties by brigades are given below from the war records, as far as they appear. Also, in a second table, the Federal casualties are distributed among the different actions. The casualties among general and field officers were unusually heavy. Among the Federals' commanding corps were Reno and Mansfield killed, and Hooker wounded. Commanding divisions or brigades were killed: Richardson, Rodman, Goodrich, and Miles. Among the wounded were Hatch, Hartsuff, Sedgwick, Crawford, Dana, Weber, Wainwright, Gallagher, Barlow, and Tyndale. Among the Confederate generals were killed Garland, G.B. Anderson, Branch, Stark, and Douglas. Among the wounded were Lawton, R.H. Anderson, Wright, Ripley, J.R. Jones, and McRae. Chapter 14. Fall of 1862. After the Battle of Sharpsburg, rest, reorganization, and supplies were badly needed by both armies, and as the initiative was now McClellan's, he determined not to move until he was thoroughly prepared. Lincoln had 2 months before drawn up his Emancipation Proclamation, and was waiting for a victory to produce a favourable state of feeling for its issuance. Sharpsburg was now claimed as a victory, and on September 22 the proclamation was issued, freeing all slaves in any state which should be in rebellion on the coming Jan. 1. This was supposed to be a war measure, though nothing could have been more void of effect than it proved. McClellan did not approve of the proclamation, and he let his sentiments on the subject be known, although he issued a very proper order to the army, deprecating political discussion. His attitude, however, alienated him from the administration and the party in power in Washington. A few days after the battle, Lincoln had visited the army, and, on parting from McClellan, had expressed himself as entirely satisfied, and had told McClellan that he should not be forced to advance until he was ready. But when 2 weeks had passed, during which great quantities of supplies of all kinds were rushed to the army by every channel, McClellan on Octillo 7 received instructions to cross the Potomac and give battle to the enemy, or drive him south. The army must move now while the roads are good. On receipt of this, McClellan conferred with his chief quartermaster, who thought that sufficient supplies would be on hand within 3 days. Meanwhile, on October 10, a fresh trouble arose. Stuart with 1,800 cavalry and Pelham's battery had been sent by Lee upon a raid. Fording the Potomac, some 15 miles above Williamsport, at dawn on the 10th, by dark Stuart reached Chambersburg, where he burned a machine shop, many loaded cars, and a supply depot, paroled 285 sick and wounded Federals, and gathered about 500 horses. Next morning he moved to Emmitsburg, and thence below the mouth of the Monocacy, where he recrossed the Potomac, on the forenoon of the 12th. The distance travelled had been 126 miles, of which the last 80 from Chambersburg were accomplished without a halt. An epidemic of foot-and-mouth disease was prevailing at this time among the enemy's cavalry, and the desperate efforts to intercept Stuart, made with reduced forces, put much of it out of condition for active service, until they could get some rest and several thousand fresh horses. Pleasanton had made a march of 55 miles in 24 hours, part of the distance across the mountains by very bad roads, and Averell's brigade had travelled 200 miles in 4 days. Stuart's loss was but 1 man wounded, and his conduct of the expedition was excellent. Yet the raid risked a great deal in proportion to the results accomplished. It might easily have happened that the whole command should be captured, but the incident contributed largely to McClellan's delay and to the growing dissatisfaction of the government with his conduct. Mr. Lincoln had allowed McClellan to decide whether his advance should be up the Shenandoah Valley or east of the Blue Ridge, but expressed a preference for the latter route. McClellan, however, had decided to take the valley route, for fear of Lee's advancing into Morden Parr if it was left uncovered. Both Lincoln and Halleck thought his fears groundless and his caution excessive. Neither of them believed the Confederate army to be as immense as McClellan reported, and both knew that if the Federals needed supplies, the Confederates needed them much more. In Lincoln's practical style, he often made pertinent suggestions to McClellan and would sometimes mingle with them a touch of sarcasm. He wrote that if Lee should cut in between the Army of the Potomac and Washington, McClellan would have nothing to do but to attack him in the rear. Soon after Stuart's raid, he suggested that, if the enemy had more occupation south of the river, his cavalry would not be so likely to make raids north of it. And on October 25, he telegraphed McClellan in reply to a dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses, "Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigues anything?" On October 26, McClellan put his army in motion, 19 days after his receipt of the President's order. By this time he was willing to adopt the line of advance east of the Blue Ridge, as the stage of water in the Potomac River now made all fords impracticable. The crossing was made at Berlin, about 10 miles below Harper's Ferry. Pontoon bridges were laid, and the army crossed over rather leisurely, the last of it, Franklin's Corps, on November 1 and 2. We will now return to the Confederates, who, since Sharpsburg, have been resting and recuperating between Winchester and Bunker Hill. Our base of supplies was now Staunton, more than 100 miles distant, but over fairly good roads. Our trains were actively at work, bringing ammunition, food and clothing, and gradually our condition approached the normal. But the supply, even of wagons, was limited, and as late as October 20, 55 were wanted for the reserve ordnance train of Longstreet's corps, and 41 for that of Jackson. Meanwhile, as important as re-equipment, a thorough reorganization took place, and at last we became an army rather than a collection of brigades, divisions, and batteries. In October, Longstreet and Jackson were made lieutenant generals, and major generals and brigadiers were promoted, and our 1st and 3rd Army Corps were formed, following the example of the Federals nearly a year before. The formation of our batteries into battalions was also carried forward, but rather slowly. A large proportion of our guns were but 6 PR and 12 PR howitzers, which the enemy had now discarded as too light. There are no returns showing our different varieties of small arms, but that we still had men armed with flintlocks is shown by the return of 13 picked up on the field after the Battle of Fredericksburg. The organization, when completed, stood as follows, the strength being given from the returns of November 20, 1862. On October 27, Lee moved with Longstreet's corps and Pendleton's reserve artillery toward the eastern slope of the Blue Ridge. My reserve ordnance train moved on the 29th via Nineveh, Front Royal, Chester Gap, Gaines's Cross Roads, and Sperryville, and encamped at Culpeper on November 4. Lee, in person, had already arrived there. A few days after, I was placed in command of the battalion of artillery which had been commanded by Col. S.D. Lee, who was now promoted brigadier general and sent to Vicksburg. My successor as chief of ordnance was Colonel Briscoe G. Baldwin, who served with great success until the surrender at Appomattox. Meanwhile, an important event was on foot. We have seen the lack of cordiality between McClellan and the President, and the growth of mistrust of the latter's intention to prosecute the active offensive campaign desired. On October 27, he had telegraphed the President urging the necessity of filling the old regiments with drafted men before taking them into action again. The tone of his letters had long been unsatisfactory, and this expression kindled into flame the growing suspicion that he was simply preparing new excuses for delay. Immediately on reading the message, Lincoln showed himself ready to meet the issue by wiring back, "Now I ask a distinct answer to the question, is it your purpose not to go into action again until the men now being drafted in the States are incorporated into the old regiments?" McClellan read between the lines the threat conveyed and backed squarely down. He promptly explained that the offensive dispatch was the inadvertence of an aide, and promised to push forward as rapidly as possible and endeavour to meet the enemy. Indeed, the Confederates noted during the next week the unwanted vigour of his advance. There were constant sharp skirmishes, and the enemy got possession of the 2 lower gaps in the Blue Ridge Snickers and Ashby's, and held the outlet of Manassas Gap. McClellan's headquarters were advanced to Rectortown. His cavalry occupied Warrenton, and it was evident that he would soon cross the Rappahannock. Then, suddenly, his activity ceased, and from Nov. 9 to the 17th, the Federal army laid quietly in its camps. His back-down had come too late. He had been removed from the command on Nov. 7, and Burnside substituted in his place. McClellan's promises of Octi Said 27 might have satisfied President Lincoln, but there were strong influences now determined upon a change, and which wanted not only the head of McClellan, but that of Porter. On November 5, the President wrote an order authorizing Halleck, in his own discretion, to relieve McClellan, and to place Burnside in command of the army. Porter was also to be relieved from the command of the 5th Corps, and to be succeeded by Hooker. On the same date, these formal orders were prepared and signed by Halleck, but they were not promulgated for 2 days. The designation of Burnside to succeed McClellan was a great surprise to old army circles, both in the Federal and Confederate armies, and was perhaps an unpleasant one to Burnside himself. He was popular, but not greatly esteemed as a general. He had commanded a brigade at the First Battle of Bull Run, but had in no way risen above, even if he reached the average of the brigade commanders. He had later had the luck to command the expedition to the NC Sounds, where his overwhelming force easily overcame the slight resistance that it met. This gained him the prestige in newspapers and political circles of successful independent command. As commander of a corps, he was one of the 4 next in line for promotion: Burnside, Hooker, Sumner, and Franklin. The older officers dreaded Hooker's appointment. By many he was thought utterly unfit, though a brave man and a hard fighter. Moved by the wishes of his friends, Burnside was brought to accept the command, rather than see it go to Hooker. McClellan was not unprepared for the blow, and he met it gracefully, and did all in his power to commend his successor to the confidence of the army. He had not, however, anticipated that he was to be relegated to private life, but had supposed that he would be transferred to some command in the West. But no other command was ever offered him. A few days later, Burnside submitted to the President his plan for the campaign, and it was approved, though reluctantly. McClellan's plan had been to interpose between Lee's divided forces. Already he was not far from such a position. From Longstreet's corps to Jackson's was over 40 miles by the roads across the mountains, and McClellan's forces were within 20 miles of either. But Lee could have delayed a march upon either, and by falling back might unite his 2 corps behind the Robertson River, before accepting battle. This had been Lee's plan if the threat of Jackson's position upon the Federal flank should fail to prevent their advance. Burnside's organization was as follows. Burnside began his campaign with a blunder. He adopted Richmond as his objective instead of Lee's army. The latter was within a day's march of him, and its wings were separated by 2 days' march. Here was an opportunity for a skillful commander, but Burnside decided to make Fredericksburg a base, and to move thence upon Richmond. On November 15, he turned his back upon Lee and marched for Fredericksburg. Meanwhile, he had made some important changes in his organization by the formation of 3 grand divisions out of his 6 corps in order to lessen the routine duties of his office. Besides the troops shown above, the Right Grand Division comprised 2 brigades of cavalry and a battery, and each of the others 1 brigade of cavalry and a battery. There was also an artillery reserve of 12 batteries, an engineer brigade with the pontoon train, and an escort and a provost guard of infantry and cavalry. On December 10, the return of the army showed present for duty, as follows. The artillery comprised 374 guns. Besides these troops, there were 2 corps, the 11th, with 15,562 present for duty under Sigel, and the 12th with 12,162 under Slocum, which Burnside called his reserve Grand Division. These troops, under command of Sigel, were on the march to Fredericksburg, but they did not arrive until after the battle. Besides these, there were 51,970 holding the line of the Potomac above Washington, and the fortified lines about the city and Alexandria, with 284 guns of position and 120 field pieces. Thus, altogether, there were available for use against Lee and to protect the capital 198,546 men and about 900 guns. On the same day, December 10, Lee's return showed his present for duty, by divisions, as follows. Adding Pendleton's reserve artillery, 718, Stuart's cavalry, 9146, and 41 general staff, we have Lee's aggregate, 78,483, and about 250 guns. This was practically the largest army which Lee ever had in the field. Possibly during the 7 days, more troops were near Richmond, but being organised only in divisions or in independent brigades and batteries, and thus less easy to handle, they constituted a much less powerful army. As before stated, on November 15, Burnside commenced his movement upon Fredericksburg, Sumner's grand division leading the way. Already his cavalry had made reconnaissance which had attracted attention, and Lee, on the 15th, had sent a regiment of cavalry, one of infantry, and a battery to reinforce 4 companies of infantry and a battery already at Fredericksburg. Orders were also sent to destroy the railroad from Fredericksburg to Aquia Creek. On the 17th it was learned that gunboats and transports had entered Aquia Creek, on which W.H.F. Lee's brigade of cavalry was dispatched in that direction, and Stuart was ordered to force a crossing of the Rappahannock and reconnoitre toward Warrenton. This was done on the 18th, and the enemy's general movement was discovered. A part of Longstreet's corps was put in motion on the 18th, and the remainder followed next day. Sumner's corps arrived at Falmouth on the 17th, and an artillery duel ensued across the river, rashly provoked by the Confederates, who had orders to oppose any force attempting to cross. It really came near inducing the enemy to cross, though under orders from Burnside not to do so. For under the superior metal of the Federals, the Confederate gunners were driven from their guns. There was a ford in the vicinity, and the temptation was strong to come over for them, but the existence of orders prevented its being done. For Burnside had feared that Lee would overwhelm any small force which should cross before he was prepared to support it. Lincoln and Halleck, indeed, had only consented to the movement via Fredericksburg, with the understanding that the army should possess itself of the heights opposite the town, by crossing the river above and coming down. Burnside had deliberately changed this plan after starting on the march. After the battle, his personal responsibility for the changed result was brought home to him unpleasantly. Swinton asserts that Burnside did not favour operating against Richmond by the overland route, but had his mind turned toward a repetition of McClellan's movement to the peninsula, and in determining to march to Fredericksburg, he cherished the hope of being able to winter there upon an easy base of supplies, and in the spring embarking his army for the James River. The 3 weeks' delay between his arrival and his crossing the river suggests the lack of definite plans. At first, the delay was attributed to the non-arrival of pontoon trains. These trains had been ordered on November 6 from Rectortown to Washington City. This order failed to reach Berlin until the 12th. Sumner was anxious to cross, and asked Burnside if he might do so without waiting for pontoons, if he could find a ford. He had found the ford before he made the request, but Burnside's inclinations were adverse to a battle, and he could not be beguiled. So the small Confederate force held the town until the 20th, when Longstreet arrived with McLaws's division, and was followed the next day by the remainder of the corps. On the 21st, Sumner sent a formal demand for the surrender of the town, basing it upon the statement that his troops had been fired upon from under cover of the houses, and that mills and manufactories in the town were furnishing provisions and clothing to the enemy. He demanded an answer by 5 p.m., and said that if the surrender was not immediate at 9 next morning, he would shell the town, the intermediate 16 hours being allowed for the removal of women and children. This note, only received by the mayor at 4:40 p.m., was referred to Longstreet, who authorized a reply to be made that the city would not be used for the purposes complained of, but that the Federals could only occupy the town by force of arms. Mayor Slaughter pointed out that the civil authorities had not been responsible for the firing which had been done, and further, that during the night it would be impossible to remove the non-combatants. During the night, Sumner sent word that in consideration of the pledges made, and in view of the short time remaining for the removal of women and children, the batteries would not open as had been proposed. But the letter left it to be inferred that the purpose to shell was only postponed, and Lee, who had now arrived, advised the citizens to vacate the town. This advice was followed by the greater part of the population. It was pitiable to see the refugees endeavouring to remove their possessions and encamping in the woods and fields, for miles around, during the unusually cold weather which soon followed. This incident is responsible for the existence of most of the earthworks, which at the time of the battle contributed largely to the repulse of the enemy's assaults upon Mary's Hill. Great sympathy, of course, was felt for the citizens, and Lee, immediately after his arrival, ordered batteries to be erected, from which the enemy's positions, upon the hills commanding the town from the north, could be replied to by our rifled guns, in case of their shelling the town. Lee at first had not intended to give battle at Fredericksburg, but had proposed, after delaying the enemy, to fall back behind the North Anna River, and to deliver his battle there. Both he and Jackson objected to the position at Fredericksburg that the river, with the commanding positions on the north bank, could always afford a safe retreat to a beaten enemy, as the Antietam had done at Sharpsburg. This was undoubtedly true, as was soon afterward proved when the battle took place. At the North Anna, the enemy, if defeated, might be successfully pursued and some fruits of victory be gathered. But the position at Fredericksburg soon began to show its good points, and as the country behind the Rappahannock was able to supply some subsistence which would otherwise be lost, it was decided to give battle at Fredericksburg against Jackson's protest. Burnside's pontoons arrived on November 25. By this time a few earthworks showed upon the Confederate hills, and led him to delay and to reconnoitre the river for a flank movement. Above Fredericksburg the country was hilly and wooded. The river was narrow, and there were several fords. These features would have made a crossing easy to accomplish by a surprise. Below the town the river widened and the country opened. Yet Burnside adopted that flank for his movement, and began his preparations to cross at Skinker's Neck, 12 miles below Fredericksburg, where the river was over 1,000 feet wide. Lee discovered his preparations, and as Jackson's corps had arrived from the valley about November 29, it was moved to the right, and observed the river as far as Port Royal, 18 miles below. Jackson had not left Winchester until November 22, 5 days after Sumner's arrival at Falmouth. His troops had marched 150 miles in 10 days, but Lee and Jackson had both presumed largely on Burnside's want of enterprise in allowing, for even a few days, 150 miles to separate the two corps. Lee had given no express orders to Jackson, but as late as November 19 had written him to remain in the valley as long as his presence embarrassed the enemy, but to keep in view that the two corps must be united in order to give battle. The Federal army was supplied with balloons. McClellan had used them on the peninsula, but during Pope's campaign and in Maine they had not been seen, although the open character of the country would have often exposed and embarrassed the most important movements of the Confederates, had balloonists been on the lookout.